And we are very, very happy to have with us our dear brother, David Abdullah, once again. And he is going to share with us his new thinking now since the kidnapping has taken place. David, welcome once again.
Maulana, thank you very much for having me back again. And yes, when we last spoke, you were making the point, and I agreed, that the United States, it was inevitable.
Inevitable.
That was the word that we used.
Yeah.
For the attack on Venezuela. We were looking and discussing the different options of military attack, but we said the attack was inevitable. And I think we were all a bit surprised at how easily that happened on early Saturday morning. Quite clearly, the U.S. forces were able to shut down all of Venezuela's air defenses, their communication systems, and so on, and therefore they were able to get in and get out, without any counterattack taking place. But we do have to recognize that 32 Cubans were killed, part of President Maduro's security detail, and there were quite a number of Venezuelans who were also killed. The Western media is not talking about that. And since then, I had a program just a few days ago on my Tuesday talk with the MSJ and had someone from Venezuela speaking. And the report that she gave was that people have been coming out in their thousands in support of President Maduro, calling for his release, immediate release from the United States, and in support of the Bolivarian revolution continuing. The Western media is not carrying those reports. And there are massive protests that took place in London. There were 2,000 people outside number 10 Downing Street on Monday, demanding that Starmer take a position. Of course, he hasn't. In fact, he has. He's a position in support of the U.S. because he used the RAF just a day or so ago to help the Americans seize the Russian oil tanker in the North Atlantic. But there was thousands of people demonstrating in Italy and France, in throughout Europe, Spain, in support of the Bolivarian process and against U.S. imperialism. So we're in a really new moment, historical moment, where the United States essentially has torn up all of the international norms that have been in place, certainly since 1945, after the end of the Second World War. They have torn up the United Nations Charter, because the UN Charter in Article 2.4 says very explicitly that no state shall use force or threaten to use force against any other state or any other political territory and so on. It's very, very clear. And it's also very clear that the head of government or head of state has immunity from prosecution in another country's jurisdiction. Now, not the International Criminal Court, because that's an international body, but no country can try a sitting head of state or head of government in their country. So what the United States is doing is totally illegal, goes totally contrary to international law, against the United Nations Charter. But Mr. Trump thinks that he could do whatever he pleases, whenever he pleases, wherever he pleases. So he's threatening Colombia, he's threatening Cuba. We spoke about that on the last occasion, that it's not just Venezuela, but it is about the U.S. trying to capture as much as of the world's resources, starting in this hemisphere, but not stopping. And they bombed Nigeria on Christmas Day, on the 25th of December, supposedly because Trump said that Christians were being killed and were facing genocide, which is not true at all. And the real intent, in my view, of going after Nigeria was to begin to signal that they're going after the Sahel. And I believe there was a report that there was an attempted coup d'etat in Burkina Faso against Captain Traoré.
This happened.
Just after, a few days after they bombed Nigeria. So a lot is happening and it is about, you're right, the U.S. economy is in decline. And so they're in huge debt. the American government is in huge debt. They're running massive fiscal deficits, and they're getting bigger under Trump because he's given the billionaire class tax breaks. And at the same time, they're running a huge external trade deficit because the United States imports more than they export. And the only way they can sustain that, which is artificially being sustained, is by keeping the dollar as the world's principal currency of exchange. Once that goes, and people therefore no longer want to hold dollars or invest in US dollar securities in the United States, then the capital inflows going into the US, which help to balance their trade deficit, that disappears. And then the US will be no better off than any country that has a massive debt to GDP ratio of over 100% and running external account balances. In other words, their imports are greater than their exports. And so the only way they could, apart from maintaining the US dollar as the principal currency of exchange, and therefore having people buying US dollars or investing in the United States securities and so on, or buying stocks and shares on the US stock market and bond market, is to capture natural resources everywhere and subjugate countries, recolonize, because you talked about Pax Britannica. That developed on the basis of British colonialism and imperialism.
That's right.
Walter Rodney wrote about it in his famous book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa.
Okay.
So it was the extraction of wealth, the exploitation of labor, enslavement of Africans, of course, being central to that enriched Europe and helped Europe to industrialize and gain huge amounts of capital, which they didn't generate within their own domestic economies. They generated that capital by exploiting and exploiting labor and extracting resources from our countries. And the United States has done that too. But they're now at this critical moment where they have to go back and do it again in a massive way in order to save their own domestic economy.
And this discussion on international economics and on international monetary economics can take us on a fascinating road. But we have some more urgent matters to discuss, and perhaps we can invite someone from the Institute of International Relations here in St. Augustine. There is a Venezuelan scholar here.
Yes. There's a Cuban scholar.
Cuban scholar.
Cuban scholar, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I know her very well.
You know her?
Yes, she's an economist.
Yes.
Jacqueline LaGuardia.
That's right.
Yes.
If we can get her to come,
yes,
we can discuss the economics and the monetary economics of the society.
Her mother is also a highly respected economist in Cuba.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. For the Cuban economy, for the Latin American economy, and for the world economy. But we have some more urgent matters.
Yes.
We have some more urgent matters to discuss this tonight. Now then, David, the brazen attack on Venezuela, defying all conventional laws, defying the UN Charter, defying everything, the flexing of the muscles by Trump, and the kidnapping of Venezuela's president has not changed the government of Venezuela.
Correct.
The government of Venezuela is still intact. The armed forces of Venezuela are still intact. What is likely to now be a follow-up of what has happened so far? Are we likely to witness now more military interventions, not only in Venezuela, but elsewhere in this region?
Yes, and you recall, Maulana, that when we spoke, I was saying that people talk about Maduro as if he's the be-all and end-all. And I said that's not so. There's a party, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, there's a leadership and a government and the military and so on. And so they're state institutions, and those state institutions functioned right away. On the Sunday, the day afterwards, the Supreme Court met, and according to the Constitution, determined that Delcy Rodriguez, as the vice president, would become the temporary president because the President Maduro is not dead. If he had died, as President Chavez died, then they would have to call an election within 30 days, according to the Venezuelan Constitution, which is what happened in 2012, I think it was. So President Maduro was acting, and then there was an election, and he was elected. But in this case, President Maduro is alive. So he's absent from the jurisdiction, and therefore there is a temporary president or an acting president who is Delcy Rodriguez according to the Constitution. And on the Monday, quite coincidentally, the Legislative Assembly, which is their parliament, which had been elected late last year, I think it was in October or November, their term of office started in January. And therefore they were sworn in January. And when they were sworn in, or when they met as an assembly, Delcy Rodriguez actually at the same time took the oath of office as the acting president. So the institutions are there and are working, and the cabinet is working. And you're right, the military is still there and intact. So Trump said that to Delcy, if you don't behave, if he's talking to a schoolgirl, if you don't behave, then your fate will be worse than Maduro. Now, people don't know who Delcy Rodriguez is. She is the daughter of revolutionary figure in Venezuela who was fighting against repression, was jailed, tortured, and died in jail being tortured, yes, in the 70s.
Okay.
So she has within her DNA, if you wish, in her family tradition, a tradition of struggle against injustice. She lost her father when she was probably still a teenager, I suppose. Yes? So she has come up in that process. Yes, she's very highly educated, University, London, Paris, and so on, very highly educated. She's an attorney and so on. So she's a very capable person, technically, and the last few years she was very responsible for restoring Venezuela's economic growth. She was Minister of the Economy, Minister of Energy, and she had to restore Venezuela's economic growth. So she's a very competent person, but she also is a very conscious revolutionary person.
Very good.
Yes, and she's not afraid to stand up and tell other world leaders where to get off. Now, there have been reports about, which Trump has exaggerated, because I've been making some inquiries quietly, and Trump says, she's agreed to give us 50 million barrels of oil, and Rubio said she has to do whatever we tell her to do because we'll crash the Venezuelan economy. That is not what she's saying. She's saying that we will treat with the United States and everybody else with mutual respect. We will engage with them in trade and other matters, which is what Maduro was saying previously. And so she has not strayed from that position. And so it's going to be interesting now to see exactly how the government of Venezuela is going to be able to keep the economy going, because they were exporting. The media was talking about 120,000 barrels of oil. That's not true. They were exporting close to a million barrels of oil a day. They were exporting. Chevron, the United States company itself, was exporting 200,000 to 300,000 barrels of oil a day. So with now that naval blockade, it's going to be more difficult for them to export as much as they were, which would impact on their foreign exchange and government revenue and so on. But as we were mentioning in our last discussion, they have significantly recovered their agricultural sector, so they're now producing maybe 80 to 90% of all the food requirements that they need. That is major, because if people are getting food, and the food is inexpensive and so on, then that's one major problem that they don't have to deal with if that naval blockade continues. So this is going to be a key moment, and therefore Trump can always use the military to go again. But he has to now calculate on two other things. One, you did that attack once. It's not that easy to do it again the same way, because the Venezuelans will be wiser about the nature of another attack that might be coming. Secondly, the world reaction to that imperialist attack and the kidnapping of President Maduro and the First Lady Celia Flores, the world opinion and the opinion in the United States is very opposed to what Trump did. And so for him to do it again, I think is going to, the political calculations that he has to make is going to be problematic, because what is he going to argue? That Delcy was also involved in narco trafficking? You know, that he never made that case. And interestingly, the day that President Maduro and his wife appeared in court in Brooklyn, in Manhattan, the U.S. Justice Department in their indictment amended it and took out any reference to the cartel of the Suns. You remember that was what?
Okay.
They said President Maduro was the head of the cartel of the Suns, and we all saying that was a fictitious, it didn't exist. They've removed it because they know they have no evidence of that. Yes, so
Okay.
so they're to go again is greater, in my view, political risk, but you could never tell with Trump what he might do.
In other words, David, you are not anticipating further military action against Venezuela to force submission to the United States.
Not at the moment. I think they're going to try to strangle them with the naval and the air blockade.
Okay.
And see how that goes.
And then if the United States is not likely to engage in further military action against Venezuela at this time, does that mean that the rest of the region is safe from military attack from the United States at this time?
No, because although I saw statements by Trump saying that the Colombian President Petro is supposed to meet him in Washington, I don't know why Petro would go to Washington to meet Trump. I think that's a very dangerous thing to do. But Colombia, I think, is still in the sights, but more specifically Cuba.
Cuba.
I think Cuba, because Trump said Cuba is about to fall, and which is not true, but that's his statement. And Rubio, as we were discussing, really would like to destroy the Cuban Revolution. And I think, therefore, that if they do want to attack, they may try and attack on Cuba, but that is going to be far more problematic than even the attack on Venezuela in many respects.
The last time we met, we came to the conclusion, and we were correct. We were anticipating that the United States would launch an attack on Venezuela, and it happened.
Yes.
At this time, however, we do not anticipate another attack on Venezuela, but you are suggesting that it might be possible that there'll be attack on Colombia and on Cuba. Now then, the United States is engaged in very delicate negotiations with Russia on Ukraine.
Yes.
For the whole of this year. And those negotiations are reaching close to a climax now. In these negotiations, the United States has shown some measure of respect for Russia as an adversary. But we just saw something recently, that a tanker which had been stopped, and then the American Navy was pursuing this tanker, the tanker suddenly got permission from Russia to fly the Russian flag.
Correct.
And the United States chose to ignore that and to pursue the tanker and to board and to seize the tanker. In other words, throwing the glove at Russia.
Yes, and they did that with the support, the United States did it with the support of the British RAF.
Good.
That was reported, yes.
Can we establish a link between the present conduct of the United States in Venezuela and in the Western Hemisphere, flexing its muscles, and the negotiations in Ukraine to try to bring about a resolution to the problem in Ukraine. Do you see any connection between the two?
That's an interesting question, and we're getting into the realm of some suppositions, which I don't like to generally to get into. And we don't know what the conversations have been between Trump and Putin, and whether or not Trump has said to Putin, okay, we will concede many of the things you want with respect to Ukraine if you don't push us too hard on Venezuela. People have been saying those things. I have no evidence of that. I suppose time will tell. That is, of course, in the realm of possibility.
Okay.
States tend to pursue their own interests first and not necessarily pursue the interests of others.
We have just a few minutes before the Azan for Isha, but before we end, is it possible that the United States was baiting China and Russia in the Western Hemisphere, daring them to block U.S. military intervention in Venezuela, baiting them that if Russia or China had ever made the mistake of swallowing the bait and coming to defend their allies in this part of the world, Venezuela and Cuba in particular, the United States would then be prepared to take on a military confrontation with Russia and China in a region where the United States will have the upper hand because of geographical proximity, whereas the United States does not want to take on Russia in Ukraine because Russia will have the advantage of geographical proximity. We have to stop now for the Isha Azan, and until we get the Azan, we can hear your response.
Yes, I think that could have been part of the equation. But Russia and China, I think, understanding their strengths and weaknesses, would not have taken that. They didn't take the bait and would not have thought about taking the bait either. But what is significant is that they have said very clearly, certainly in terms of China, and I want to raise the question of Iran as well, because the demonstrations that have broken out in Iran seem to me to be also coincidental, because Trump then said, we will attack Iran very soon if people are killed in Iran, the protesters are killed. So that's another part of the puzzle.
Time to break for the Azan, okay. Bismillahi awwaluhu wa akhiruhu. We were discussing before the Azan broke, the Azan of Salatul Isha, the possibility of further American military intervention in this part of the world, because neither Russia nor China intervened or took the bait to intervene to save Venezuela. And therefore, Trump and his American administration is likely to recognize this as an open door to be exploited to the advantage of possible further military interventions, which will bring about a catastrophic change in this part of the world. Could you kindly respond to that?
Yes, it's quite clear that he thinks now that he is Lord of all and Master of all that he surveys. I mean, he's behaving like that, you know. He's saying, the West, and they've said it, the Western Hemisphere is our hemisphere.
That's right.
And nobody can come into this hemisphere. And the national security strategy said that they must, one of the objectives is to keep out any power from outside the hemisphere and not allow them to have any military capability or threat to the United States and so on. So that they're very explicit. I mean, one thing about Trump and his statements is that he's not hiding anything.
No.
Previous American presidents would try to dress things up in some kind of talk of democracy and values and so on. Nothing to do with values and democracy. Straight case. This is ours. We're going to control it. And it will be very difficult for Russia and China militarily unless they were to locate a base in Cuba or something like that, which would then raise the ante, like the Cuban Missile Crisis did in 1962 or 63. And so the issue would now turn, which some people are suggesting, and this is one of the things that some of the elements in the United States are very concerned about, and Western Europe, that what Trump has done by breaking the international order in this very dramatic way, that China could now say, okay, if you have done this to Venezuela, Taiwan, which officially is part of China, it's not now a separate state, it's officially part of China, that we are now going to go and take control of what is really ours, because Taiwan is part of China. And so people are fearing that that could be one of the things that develops in this context. And whether would the United States then try to intervene, because it does have military bases in that part of the world, in South Korea, Taiwan itself, elsewhere they have bases. So would the United States try to intervene in that situation where they now geographically are at a disadvantage, even though they have military assets there? So I think we are entering, Maulana, into a very dangerous stage of world history, because the actions of Trump, while seemingly rational with respect to what the U.S. wants to achieve to save its economy, by disrupting so much is also very irrational and can provoke consequences that can just spiral out of control.
Two questions, David. Anticipating further American military interventions in this region of the world after the successful intervention in Venezuela, in the kidnapping of Maduro, is it possible that countries in South and Central America and the Caribbean who feel threatened can now come together to discuss a possible military alliance where one attack on one will be an attack on all?
The problem with that, Maulana, is that there are not enough like-minded governments. There's Brazil, which is a very large country, of course. There's Mexico. And apart from those two, Venezuela is in a weakened situation now. There's Cuba, which has its own challenges. Colombia, and that's about it. Argentina is very pro-Trump. So now is Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Paraguay, El Salvador, and Honduras now is likely to go that same route. Guatemala. So when you look at the number of countries in South and Central America, the majority of them would be pro-American, majority.
So is it then that Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and Cuba are likely to continue to simply sit down and not do something to enhance their security?
They obviously will enhance their security, but I'm not so sure if it will be in the form of a pact,
okay,
intra-country pact.
Okay,
Yes.
That brings me to my next question. Korea has demonstrated to the world in a very plain and clear and dramatic way that the Western world will not respect you unless and until you have a deterrent power that they must respect. And so Korea became a nuclear power. And not only a nuclear power, but the missile capacity to deliver a nuclear weapon, even to reach the United States. And with a rampant Trump in this part of the world, is it possible now that you can see a movement in those states which consider them to be threatened by Trump, like Venezuela, like Mexico, like Colombia, like Cuba, and perhaps also Brazil, an effort now to recognize, as we hope Iran is now recognizing, that you will not be able to secure security from a rampant United States of America and Israel, because these two are sisters. You cannot get any security, measure of security that is adequate unless and until you have a nuclear deterrent.
Yes, and the challenge with that, of course, is that it takes some time for them to develop that deterrent, unless it is supplied directly by a country that has that capability. And any attempt, therefore, to develop it internally, the Americans will then bomb it as they did Iran. Yes, that would be what they would do. The interesting thing is that, of course, not spoken about much, is that South Africa has that deterrent. That was the West during apartheid allowed South Africa to develop that.
Okay.
It's not talked about, but I'm pretty certain I'm right about that, because the apartheid regime was part of the imperial and colonial agenda for Africa.
Right.
Yes. And of course, when the government changed, it's now in the hands of the South African government. So, but whether Mexico or Brazil can do that on their own independently would be, I think, take them too long and very difficult, because they're not known for having developed those kinds of programs. You don't hear about them. But in this, it could be that they could be given it.
That's right.
It could be given it.
Okay.
And by Trump tearing up the international order, the UN Charter, and he just withdrew from 66 international organizations, 30 of them or more being UN organizations, including the very important UN framework for climate change and so on. So if he's tearing up all the orders, world order, then there's no reason why countries can say we are going to